Number 1. David Koresh. He called himself the Lamb of God, a man who claimed he alone could interpret the Bible's deepest secrets. To his followers, David Koresh wasn't just a preacher, he was the living voice of prophecy. But the story of how a quiet Texas preacher turned into the center of one of the most infamous sieges in American history begins long before the fires of Waco. David Koresh was born Vernon Wayne Howell in 1959 inches, Houston, Texas. His childhood was lonely and chaotic. His mother was just 14 when he was born, and his father abandoned the family early. Growing up, Vernon struggled with learning difficulties and was often bullied. Yet, even as a young man, he had a strange confidence about him, a sense that he was destined for something greater. By his late teens, he had memorized large portions of the Bible and began preaching to anyone who would listen. He believed God had chosen him for a divine purpose, and that belief would soon define his entire life. In the early 1980s, he joined a small religious group near Waco called the Branch Davidians, a splinter sect of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They lived communally and believed the world would soon end. But Vernon, now going by David Koresh, had bigger ambitions. He told members that God spoke directly to him. By 1987, after a violent leadership struggle, Koresh had taken over the group completely. The once quiet community became his personal kingdom, and Mount Carmel, their compound, his temple. Koresh began teaching that the world was on the brink of apocalypse. He said he was the only one who could unlock the mysterious 7 seals from the Book of Revelation prophecies that foretold the end of days. His followers saw him as the chosen one, the true interpreter of God's word. Many sold their homes, left their families, and moved to Mount Carmel to await salvation. But what looked like a peaceful religious retreat was hiding something darker. Koresh's sermons grew increasingly extreme. He began declaring that all women in the group were wives of the Lamb, his wives, and that only he could father the next generation of God's chosen children. Meanwhile, men in the community were told to remain celibate and devote themselves entirely to his vision. At the same time, Koresh began stockpiling firearms, not for violence, he claimed, but for protection during the coming apocalypse. By the early 1990s, federal authorities had taken notice. In February 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, planned a raid to investigate reports of illegal weapons at the compound. But someone tipped off the Davidians. When federal agents arrived, a gunfight erupted almost immediately. 4 agents and 6 Davidians died in the first few minutes. The raid had failed, and what followed would become one of the longest and most controversial standoffs in U.S. history. For the next 51 days, the compound was surrounded by the FBI. Negotiators spoke to Koresh almost daily, trying to persuade him to surrender peacefully. But Koresh refused, claiming that God had told him to wait for a sign. Inside, his followers lived on canned food and faith. Parents read the Bible to their children while tanks and floodlights surrounded the property. To the outside world, Koresh appeared delusional, but to those inside, he was still the Messiah. As the standoff dragged on, tensions rose. The FBI believed negotiations were going nowhere. On the 19th of April 1993, they made a fateful decision to end it by force. Armored vehicles moved in, firing tear gas to flush out the occupants. Hours later, smoke began to pour from the windows. Within minutes, flames engulfed the entire compound. The fire spread fast, fueled by the wooden structure and strong winds. By the time it was over, 76 people were dead, including Koresh, who was found with a gunshot wound inside the ruins. The tragedy shocked the world. Images of the burning compound dominated headlines, and questions poured in. Who was responsible? Did the government act too aggressively? Or was Koresh's control over his followers so absolute that they were willing to die for him? Investigations revealed a pattern of manipulation and spiritual abuse inside Mount Carmel. Survivors spoke of Koresh's power over their minds, how he convinced them that dying with him meant eternal life. Koresh's legacy remains one of obsession and control disguised as faith. To some, he was a victim of government overreach. To others, a dangerous cult leader whose delusions cost innocent lives. The name David Koresh became forever linked to Waco, a symbol of how devotion can be twisted into tragedy when power and belief collide. But even after the ashes cooled, other self-proclaimed messiahs would rise, men who built vast followings, preached purity, and promised salvation, only to be unmasked as something far more human. Next up, a preacher who called himself a messenger of God, a man who turned faith into spectacle before the truth finally caught up with him. Number 2. Gurmeet Rahim Singh. He called himself the messenger of God. To millions, Gurmeet Rahim Singh wasn't just a preacher, he was a superstar. He wore glittering clothes, drove luxury cars, and performed in self-produced movies where he played a singing, motorcycle-riding savior. His followers filled entire stadiums, chanting his name as if they were witnessing a living deity. But behind the flamboyant image and the music videos lay a secret life of manipulation, power, and betrayal that would eventually bring his empire crashing down. Gurmeet Rahim Singh was born in August 1967 in Rajasthan, India. He grew up in a modest Sikh family, but by the age of 23, he had risen to prominence within a group called Dera Sasha Sauda, a spiritual sect that combined elements of Sikhism and social service. The movement preached equality and brahing, community service, and Singh was a gifted showman who knew how to connect with crowds. When he became the sect's leader in 1990, attendance at gatherings skyrocketed. He turned religious sermons into grand events complete with music, choreography, and laser lights. Under Singh's leadership, Dera Sasha Sauda claimed to have millions of followers across India and abroad. He opened schools, hospitals, and charity programs. Politicians courted his support during elections, and celebrities lined up to appear beside him. He cultivated an image of divine kindness, a godman who cared for the poor and healed the sick. But the image was carefully manufactured. Those who worked close to him would later describe a man obsessed with power, control, and adoration. By the early 2000s, rumors about Singh's behavior began to circulate quietly. Followers whispered that he demanded unquestioning loyalty, isolating those who questioned him. But few dared to speak out. His influence stretched deep into politics and law enforcement. Then, in 2002, a letter surfaced that would change everything. It was sent anonymously to India's Prime Minister and accused Singh of exploiting his female followers. The letter's author claimed to be one of his devotees. An investigation was launched, but Singh used his vast network to delay and deny. His sermons grew more defensive, filled with warnings about false allegations and enemies of faith. Meanwhile, journalists who pursued the story began receiving threats. One of them, Ramchandar Chhatrapati, published a local newspaper exposing the claims. Months later, he was shot outside his home and later died of his injuries. The case went cold for years, but it wouldn't stay buried forever. In 2017, the long-delayed verdict in the original case finally arrived. India's Central Bureau of Investigation found Singh guilty of abusing 2 of his followers. When the judgment was announced, chaos erupted. Tens of thousands of his devotees flooded the streets of Haryana, refusing to believe their guru could do wrong. Riots broke out across multiple cities. Vehicles burned, property was destroyed, and by the time order was restored, more than 35 people had died in the violence. Singh was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes. As investigations continued, authorities reopened the journalist's case, and in 2019, Singh was convicted of ordering Chhatrapati's murder as part of a cover-up. For a man who once preached compassion and self-control, it was a devastating fall from grace. Inside his empire, the shock was immense. Many of his followers couldn't accept the truth. They had believed for decades that Singh was divinely chosen, that he could perform miracles, cure diseases, and bring peace to the world. Some continued to worship him even after his imprisonment, holding prayer gatherings for his return. But for most, the illusion had been shattered. From his cell, Singh continued to make headlines. He wrote music, published spiritual messages, and even released videos from prison through his organization's channels, still insisting on his innocence. Yet, the evidence had been overwhelming, and the myth of the messenger of God was no longer unbreakable. What made his story so striking wasn't just the crimes, but how carefully he had blended religion and entertainment. He understood spectacle, how faith could be staged like a concert, how charisma could become worship. And when the truth finally emerged, the same adoring crowds that once lifted him to fame watched his empire collapse live on national television. Today, Gurmeet Rahim Singh remains incarcerated, serving multiple sentences. His sect still exists, but it's fractured and diminished. Once, he stood on stage in jeweled jackets, under spotlights, calling himself a servant of God. Now, he spends his days behind bars, a symbol of how easily power can corrupt even the most sacred of roles. His story left India stunned, a reminder that the line between devotion and deception can be dangerously thin. And as the dust settled, another revered spiritual figure's downfall would soon grip the world, this time, one whose influence reached millions and whose conviction would shake a nation's faith in its holy men. Number 3. Asaram Bapu. He was once hailed as one of India's most powerful spiritual leaders, a man who claimed to heal with a touch, read minds, and speak directly to the divine. To millions, Asaram Bapu wasn't just a preacher. He was a living saint. His face appeared on posters, his voice echoed across television networks, and his empire of ashrams stretched across India and beyond. But behind the white robes and the calm smile lay a darker truth, one that would unravel his reputation, destroy his legacy, and land him behind bars for life. Asaram Bapu was born Asumal Harpalani in April 1941 inches, the Sindh region, which is now part of Pakistan. After the partition of India, his family moved to Gujarat, where he grew up in poverty. From humble beginnings, Asaram reinvented himself as a mystic. In the 1970 seconds, he began preaching in small gatherings, blending elements of Hindu philosophy, meditation, and moral discipline. His charisma was undeniable. People found peace in his presence, and donations poured in. Over time, he transformed from a local preacher into a global figure, the guru of the masses. By the 1990 seconds and early 2000s, Asaram's influence had become almost untouchable. He ran hundreds of ashrams, hosted massive spiritual events, and preached the virtues of simplicity and self-control. Politicians courted his support, and his organization claimed tens of millions of followers. His sermons drew stadium-sized crowds, and his words were broadcast to households across India. To his devotees, he was the voice of God on earth, the man who could bring them closer to salvation. But as his fame grew, so did whispers of something sinister. Former followers began to hint that not all was as peaceful inside Asaram's sprawling ashrams. Rumors of exploitation and corruption started surfacing, but his influence was so vast that few dared to question him publicly. His inner circle was fiercely loyal, and critics were often silenced or discredited. Everything changed in 2013. That year, a teenage girl and her parents went to police, accusing Asaram of serious misconduct during a private healing session at one of his ashrams in Jodhpur, Rajasthan. The allegations sent shockwaves through India. At first, Asaram dismissed it all as a conspiracy, a plot by political enemies and jealous rivals. But as evidence mounted, the authorities had no choice but to act. When police arrived to arrest him, Asaram refused to cooperate. His followers surrounded his ashram, chanting and blocking entry. It took days of negotiation and hundreds of officers to finally bring him in. As cameras flashed and crowds gathered, the once revered guru was led away in handcuffs, a sight few in India could have imagined just months earlier. The trial was one of the most closely watched in the nation's history. Witnesses described a secretive inner world hidden behind the public facade of holiness. Prosecutors detailed how Asaram used his position of power to exploit vulnerable followers, while his defense claimed it was all a political setup. The courtroom was often filled with tension, and outside, His supporters protested furiously, clashing with police and threatening journalists who covered the case. In April 2018, the verdict finally came. Asaram Bapu was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The court called his crimes unforgivable, especially given the trust and reverence his followers had placed in him. The judgment came with extraordinary security authorities feared riots or attempts to disrupt the sentencing, but the justice system held firm, and the man once worshipped as divine was now an inmate serving a life sentence. In the years since, Asaram's empire has crumbled. Many of his ashrams have closed, his organization has fractured, and his son, once seen as his spiritual heir, has faced criminal allegations of his own. The guru who once traveled the world in luxury now lives in a prison cell in Jodhpur, spending his days in isolation, writing letters to his remaining followers who still call him Bapuji. The downfall of Asaram Bapu marked one of the most dramatic collapses in modern Indian spiritual history. It revealed how blind devotion can protect those who abuse it, and how power, once unchecked, can destroy even those who claim to serve a higher purpose. Yet, his case was only one chapter in a much larger pattern of faith twisted into manipulation and of millions misled by the promise of divine purity. And as India grappled with the shock of seeing one guru behind bars, another equally adored and internationally known would soon face his own reckoning. Next up, a man once praised as a miracle worker and even visited by global celebrities until hundreds came forward and his empire of healing turned into a crime scene. Number 4. João Teixeira de Faria, John of God. For decades, people traveled from all over the world to a small town in Brazil, chasing a promise of miracles. They came in wheelchairs, on crutches, and with broken hearts, all seeking one man. He called himself John of God, and his followers swore he could heal the incurable. Celebrities endorsed him, journalists documented his supposed powers, and even Oprah Winfrey visited his center. But beneath the calm voice and spiritual aura of this so-called healer lay one of the most disturbing frauds in modern spiritual history. João Teixeira de Faria was born in 1,942 inches, the central Brazilian town of Cachoeira de Goiás. He left school in his early teens and drifted from job to job before claiming to have been visited by a divine spirit that gave him healing powers. Soon after, he began performing what he described as spiritual surgeries procedures done without anesthesia, often using simple tools like scissors or scalpels. People said they felt no pain. To those desperate for hope, it looked like divine intervention. By the 1,970 seconds, João had founded the Casa de Dom Inácio de Loyola, a massive healing center in the town of Abadiânia. Each week, thousands arrived, waiting for hours just to see him. He claimed that spirits worked through him to cure everything from blindness to cancer. Those who visited described a peaceful presence, as if being near him could wash away pain itself. His fame spread far beyond Brazil. Documentaries featured his work. Faith-based tourists flooded the small town, bringing millions in donations. For decades, no one dared to question him. But what began as a story of hope slowly revealed cracks. Journalists noticed inconsistencies in his supposed healings. Doctors called his surgeries theatrical illusions. And still, people kept coming convinced faith was stronger than science. That trust would prove devastating when, in 2018, a series of televised reports shattered his saintly image forever. A prominent Brazilian journalist aired interviews with women who accused João of abusing them during private healing sessions. Soon, hundreds more came forward. The details were chilling, and the flood of testimonies turned the small town into the center of a nationwide reckoning. João's followers, once fiercely loyal, began questioning everything. The same man who had preached divine compassion was now being described as a manipulator who had used faith as a shield. Authorities moved quickly. João was arrested at the end of 2018 after surrendering to police, though he denied all wrongdoing. The case drew massive media attention not only in Brazil but worldwide. For years, he had been considered a national treasure, a spiritual healer who embodied Brazilian faith and mysticism. Now, he was facing trial for exploiting the very people who had trusted him most. During the investigation, police found evidence of large amounts of cash hidden in his properties, signs of immense personal profit built from decades of donations. His legal team tried to argue that the claims were exaggerated or politically motivated, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. In December 2019, João Teixeira de Faria, once called John of God, was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 19 years in prison. More charges soon followed, with additional sentences added over time. In prison, João's empire collapsed. His healing center closed, the flow of visitors stopped, and the once thriving economy of Abadiânia nearly vanished overnight. Oprah Winfrey, who had once featured him on her show, publicly expressed disgust and regret, saying she was sickened by the revelations. For many Brazilians, it was a painful lesson about how easily hope can turn into deception. Even now, João maintains his innocence, occasionally issuing statements through his lawyers. But few believe him anymore. The man who claimed to channel saints now spends his days behind bars, no longer surrounded by cameras and chanting crowds, but by silence. His story stands as one of the most shocking downfalls in the world of faith healing, a tale of charisma, illusion, and betrayal. People believed they were witnessing miracles. In truth, they were watching a man build an empire on the most powerful human emotion of all faith. And as the world absorbed the fall of John of God, attention soon turned back to another figure, one whose name had already become infamous across generations. A man who began with promises of equality and salvation, only to lead hundreds to their deaths in the jungles of South America. Number 5. Jim Jones. He called it the Promised Land, a place where people of every race and class could live together in peace, free from prejudice and greed. For his followers, Jim Jones was more than a preacher. He was a savior, a man who promised heaven on earth. But what began as a dream of equality ended with over 900 people dead in the Guyanese jungle, in one of the darkest chapters of modern history. Jim Jones was born in 1931 inches, the small town of Crete, Indiana. His childhood was marked by poverty and loneliness. From an early age, he was fascinated by religion and power. He preached to neighborhood kids, performed mock funerals for animals, and spoke passionately about God and justice. To those who knew him, there was something magnetic about his intensity and something unsettling about his need for control. By the 1952, Jones had become a legitimate pastor, founding the People's Temple in Indianapolis. He preached a message of racial integration, charity, and social equality at a time when segregation still defined much of American life. He welcomed the poor, the marginalized, and those who felt forgotten by traditional churches. For many, he seemed like a revolutionary, a preacher who truly practiced what he preached. But the charm that drew people in was masking something darker. As the congregation grew, Jones became obsessed with loyalty. He encouraged followers to call him Father, to confess their sins directly to him, and to cut ties with family members who doubted his authority. When local media began questioning his practices, he grew paranoid, claiming powerful enemies were plotting against him. By the mid-1972, he moved the entire movement to California, setting up new headquarters in San Francisco. There, the People's Temple gained political influence. Jones met with city officials, raised money for humanitarian projects, and even supported political campaigns. Yet inside the temple, he ruled with an iron hand. In 1977, amid growing allegations of abuse and fraud, Jones made a drastic decision. He relocated more than 900 followers to a remote settlement in Guyana, South America. He called it Jonestown, a socialist paradise built in the middle of the jungle. At first, it seemed idyllic: gardens, schools, music, and communal living. But soon, reality set in. Food shortages, harsh conditions, and armed guards replaced the dream. Followers were forced to work long hours, cut off from the outside world. Letters were censored. Escape was nearly impossible. Jones's paranoia deepened. He began broadcasting long, late-night sermons over loudspeakers, warning his followers that the U.S. government would destroy them if they tried to return home. Those who questioned him were punished or publicly humiliated. Behind the microphone, Jones's voice grew slurred from drug use, his rambling speeches drifting between salvation and doom. The man who once preached compassion now demanded total obedience. In November 1978, a group of concerned relatives and journalists persuaded U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan to visit Jonestown to investigate reports of abuse. At first, Jones welcomed them with smiles, tours, and songs. But when a few members asked to leave with Ryan's group, everything began to unravel. As the congressman and his delegation prepared to depart from a nearby airstrip, Jones ordered his armed guards to stop them. Gunfire erupted. Congressman Ryan, 3 journalists, and 1 defector died at the scene. Back at Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers and told them it was time to make a revolutionary act. Large vats of cyanide-laced drink were prepared. Parents were instructed to give it to their children first. Within hours, the entire community lay silent. Over 900 people, including more than 200 children, died in the mass poisoning. Jones himself was found among them, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. When news of the tragedy broke, the world was stunned. Television screens filled with images of lifeless bodies scattered across the jungle floor. The name Jim Jones became synonymous with fanaticism, control, and the terrifying power of blind faith. The phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," entered popular culture as a grim reminder of how easily devotion can turn into destruction. In the aftermath, investigations revealed how deeply Jones had manipulated his followers, cutting them off from family, controlling their money, and convincing them that he alone could save their souls. Survivors spoke of fear and isolation, of a man who preached love while creating an atmosphere of terror. Jim Jones's story endures not just as a tragedy, but as a warning of how faith, when fused with unchecked power, can consume everything around it. What began as a movement for justice ended as one of the largest mass deaths in modern history. Yet, even after Jonestown, stories of fallen spiritual leaders didn't stop. Around the world, new preachers would rise to fame, their words reaching millions, their influence stretching across continents until their secrets surfaced and the truth came crashing down. Next up, a world-renowned Christian speaker celebrated for his intellect and moral clarity until shocking revelations after his death shattered everything his name once stood for. Number 6, Ravi Zacharias. He was known as the man who could make skeptics believe again. Ravi Zacharias stood on the grandest stages of faith, from Ivy League universities to international conferences, calmly defending Christianity with logic, compassion, and charm. For millions of believers, he was a symbol of intellectual faith, the perfect bridge between reason and religion. But when the truth emerged after his death, it left the Christian world stunned. The man once seen as a moral giant was hiding a double life that would unravel his legacy forever. Ravi Zacharias was born in 1946 inches, Chennai, India, into a middle-class Christian family. His upbringing was strict, and as a teenager, he struggled with self-worth, purpose. At 17, after a period of depression, he found solace in the Bible, an experience that changed his life. He immigrated to Canada, later settling in the United States, where he studied theology and began preaching. By the late 1972, he was gaining attention as a brilliant speaker, eloquent, articulate, and fearless in debates. In 1984, he founded the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, or RZEM, in Atlanta, Georgia. His mission was simple: to defend Christianity against the growing tide of atheism and secularism. Through books, radio shows, and lectures, Zacharias became one of the most recognizable apologists in the world. His soft-spoken delivery and intellectual tone gave him credibility across faith communities. He was invited to speak at Harvard, Oxford, and the United Nations. Politicians quoted him. Pastors cited his words in sermons. For decades, his reputation was spotless, that of a man whose faith and integrity were beyond question. But behind that image, troubling inconsistencies began to surface. Quietly, a few individuals within his organization noticed that Zacharias maintained an unusual amount of secrecy about his travel arrangements. He spent extended periods abroad, often visiting spa businesses he co-owned with partners in Atlanta. At the time, few questioned it, his staff trusted him completely. But those trips would later reveal the life he worked hard to conceal. In 2017, a woman named Lori Ann Thompson accused Zacharias of manipulating her into an inappropriate online relationship. Zacharias denied the allegations, claiming he was the victim of extortion. The ministry defended him, and the story faded from public attention. To many, it seemed like an attack on a good man. But in 2020, after Ravi Zacharias passed away from cancer, new allegations emerged, and this time, they couldn't be ignored. Within months of his death, investigative journalists and whistleblowers from within RZIM uncovered a series of hidden financial records, communications, and testimonies from women who had worked in Zacharias's wellness centers. The stories shared disturbing similarities. According to multiple accounts, he had used his position of spiritual authority to exploit women during his travels, often invoking prayer and spiritual guidance as a cover. Some had signed non-disclosure agreements or received financial settlements through ministry funds. The revelations were devastating. RZIM's board commissioned an independent investigation by a third-party law firm. When the report was published in February 2021, its findings were undeniable. The investigators confirmed multiple cases of misconduct stretching over more than a decade. Zacharias, they concluded, had lived a carefully compartmentalized life, one built on public virtue and private corruption. The reaction across the Christian world was immediate. His books were pulled from stores, radio stations stopped airing his sermons, and his ministry, once one of the largest in the world, was forced to shut down. Churches that had relied on his teachings faced hard questions from their congregations. For many believers, the scandal was more than just another fall from grace. It was a personal betrayal by someone they had trusted with their faith. Zacharias's family later issued a public apology to his victims, acknowledging the truth of the findings and expressing deep regret for defending him when early warnings appeared. The organization he built for nearly 4 decades collapsed completely. What remained was a shattered reputation, a reminder that even the most polished image can hide moral decay. Today, Ravi Zacharias' story is often cited as one of the most shocking downfalls in modern religious history. He was not just a preacher, he was a brand, a global voice of moral certainty who inspired millions. Yet, in the end, the truth revealed a man who preached purity but practiced deception. His name, once synonymous with spiritual intellect, is now remembered as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority and the danger of worshiping charisma over character. Ravi Zacharias' fall left a void in the evangelical world, a silence where once there had been eloquence and conviction. But as his story faded from headlines, another preacher's scandal began to dominate the news this time. A man from Mexico whose followers worshipped him as the apostle of Jesus Christ, even as he stood trial for crimes that shocked 2 nations. Number 7. Naasón Joaquín García. For millions of followers around the world, Naasón Joaquín García was not just a preacher, he was the apostle of Jesus Christ. His followers filled stadiums in Mexico and the United States, singing hymns that praised his name and declaring him the only living messenger of God on earth. For decades, the church he led claimed purity, order, and divine authority. But behind the golden altars and carefully staged sermons was a man whose fall from grace would expose one of the most disturbing betrayals of trust in modern religious history. Naasón Joaquín García was born in 1,969 inches, Guadalajara, Mexico, into a family that had already built a religious empire. His grandfather, Eusebio Joaquín González, had founded La Luz del Mundo, the Light of the World, in 1926, claiming to be a modern-day apostle chosen directly by God. The church quickly grew into one of Mexico's most powerful religious institutions, building temples across Latin America and even reaching large immigrant communities in the U.S. When Naasón inherited leadership in 2014, after his father's death, he was hailed as the continuation of a divine bloodline, the third apostle of Jesus Christ. To his followers, Naasón seemed humble and wise. He preached about holiness, morality, and the importance of family. Under his direction, La Luz del Mundo expanded to over 50 countries, boasting more than 5 million members. Worship gatherings often looked more like royal coronations than church services, with Naasón seated on a throne-like chair surrounded by white-robed ministers. Followers sang songs in his honor, sometimes addressing him as Father or Chosen One. His image adorned church buildings and magazines. To question him was to question God himself. But the image of perfection that Naasón projected began to crumble in 2019 when U.S. authorities made a stunning announcement. On June 3rd, Naasón Joaquín García was arrested at Los Angeles International Airport and charged with dozens of felonies, including human trafficking, exploitation, and obstruction of justice. The charges detailed horrific acts allegedly committed over many years and across multiple countries. News of his arrest sent shockwaves through his church, not just in Mexico, but among congregations in California, Texas, and beyond. At first, many refused to believe it. Inside La Luz del Mundo, leaders told followers it was a spiritual test, a persecution of faith. Thousands rallied outside courthouses, holding banners that read, "We believe in the apostle." Naasón himself appeared calm during hearings, dressed in orange prison attire, quietly smiling at his supporters, as if to reassure them that God would soon deliver him. But as the case progressed, the evidence began to pile up, and the details were too extensive to ignore. Prosecutors described a web of manipulation and fear designed to keep victims silent. They showed photographs, videos, and digital communications that painted a chilling picture of a leader who had used his divine status to exploit those who trusted him most. Despite the weight of the accusations, his defense team argued that Naasón was innocent and that the entire case was part of an anti-religious conspiracy. But the narrative began to crumble under the sheer volume of witness testimony and physical evidence. In 2022, Naasón Joaquín García made a dramatic turn. After years of proclaiming his innocence, he agreed to a plea deal, admitting guilt to multiple charges involving the abuse of minors. He was sentenced to 16 years and 8 months in a California state prison. When the verdict was read, his followers wept in disbelief. Some stood outside the courthouse, singing hymns through tears. For a man who had been treated as a living apostle, the fall was incomprehensible. Even from prison, Naasón continued to address his congregation through recorded phone calls, still referring to himself as their spiritual leader. Many followers remain fiercely loyal to him today, convinced he was framed, while others have abandoned the church altogether. Disillusioned and heartbroken, his empire, once seen as the pride of Mexico's evangelical community, is now scarred by scandal and division. Naasón Joaquín García's story is not just about crime, it's about the danger of worshiping a man instead of the message. When belief in a person replaces belief in truth, faith becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. The apostle of Jesus Christ now spends his days behind bars, a symbol of a church's greatest shame. But the fall of Naasón García wasn't the first time a preacher used divine authority to build a kingdom of fear. Decades earlier, another self-proclaimed Messiah rose to power in America, a man who called himself the Son of God and ruled his followers through loyalty, violence, and absolute devotion. Number 8. Yahweh Ben Yahweh. He walked through the streets of Miami in flowing white robes, flanked by loyal followers who called him the Son of God. His name was Yahweh Ben Yahweh, meaning God, Son of God, and to thousands, he was exactly that. He claimed to be the living embodiment of divinity, a savior for Black Americans who had been denied justice and identity. But behind the polished sermons and the gospel of empowerment was a reign of fear, secrecy, and violence that would turn one man's vision of liberation into one of the most chilling cult movements in U.S. history. Yahweh Ben Yahweh was born Hulan Mitchell Jr. in 1,935 inches, Kingfisher, Oklahoma. His father was a preacher, and his childhood revolved around church life. Mitchell was bright, ambitious, and restless. He earned degrees, served in the Air Force, and spent years searching for meaning. By the time he moved to Miami in 1979, he was ready to start something new, a movement that would blend religion, racial pride, and absolute authority. He founded the Nation of Yahweh, a black Hebrew Israelite sect that taught African Americans were the true descendants of the biblical Israelites. His message resonated deeply in the communities of Liberty City, which were plagued by poverty and discrimination. People felt seen, empowered, and chosen. Dressed in white robes and turbans, members called each other brother and sister. They greeted Yahweh with chants of "Our Father, Yahweh," and believed he could perform miracles. Within a few years, his congregation grew to thousands. Businesses, apartment complexes, and schools sprang up under his organization. Local politicians even praised his efforts to clean up the city. But beneath the surface of success, something darker was growing. Yahweh's teachings became more extreme. He demanded total loyalty and obedience, claiming those who doubted him were enemies of God. Former followers described all-night meetings where he ranted about divine vengeance and purification. Some members disappeared after questioning his leadership. Inside his compound, fear began to replace faith. By the mid-1982, law enforcement was investigating the group for violent acts tied to what Yahweh called purification rituals. Police reports documented brutal assaults, arsons, and even killings, all allegedly carried out by members trying to prove loyalty to their leader. According to prosecutors, Yahweh ordered his inner circle, known as the Death Angels, to target anyone who betrayed or mocked him. The crimes were gruesome and ritualized, carried out with cold precision. In 1990, the federal government launched one of the largest investigations into a religious movement in U.S. history. Yahweh Ben Yahweh and several of his top followers were indicted on multiple counts, including racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. The indictment detailed a network of fear followers, intimidated witnesses, destroyed evidence, and carried out orders with near-military discipline. During the trial, prosecutors described how Yahweh had built a cult of personality so powerful that his followers would do anything in his name, believing they were fulfilling God's will. In 1992, Yahweh Ben Yahweh was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and racketeering. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Even then, he never admitted guilt. From his cell, he continued to preach, calling himself a prophet persecuted for spreading truth. Many of his followers remained loyal throughout his imprisonment, refusing to believe he could have done any wrong. He was released on parole in 2001 after serving most of his sentence, but was forbidden from associating with his former followers or practicing public ministry. He lived quietly until his death in 2007. To some, he died a misunderstood preacher. To others, he was a manipulative cult leader whose charisma turned faith into fanaticism. The story of Yahweh Ben Yahweh serves as a chilling reminder of how spiritual authority can be twisted into absolute power. He began with a message of hope and racial pride, a mission to uplift the broken and forgotten, but ended as the architect of fear and violence. His followers believed they were building a holy nation. In reality, they had built a kingdom of control. Yet even after Yahweh's death, stories like his continued to emerge: preachers who preached purity while hiding corruption, men who promised enlightenment but thrived on secrecy. And one of them didn't need violence or armies to control his followers, only charm, trust, and a reputation for righteousness that lasted for decades. Number 9. Bill Gothard. For over half a century, Bill Gothard preached about obedience, purity, and moral discipline. He told millions of families that happiness came from strict authority fathers ruling homes, women submitting to men, and children following every command. He was calm, well-dressed, and endlessly polite, a picture of piety and control. To his followers, Gothard wasn't just a preacher, he was the blueprint for a godly life. But when the voices of those who had grown up under his teachings finally began to speak, his pristine reputation unraveled, revealing a hidden world of manipulation and hypocrisy that shocked even his most loyal supporters. Bill Gothard was born in 1934 Illinois, to a devout Christian family. He excelled academically and showed an early fascination with moral authority and family values. By his early 20s, he was working in youth ministry, convinced that America's spiritual decline could be reversed through strict adherence to biblical principles. In 1961, he launched what would become the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, later renamed the Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP. His seminars promised to solve the moral chaos of modern life. By the 1972, Gothard was a household name in evangelical America. His conferences filled stadiums. Over 2.5 million people attended his sessions. He taught that life's problems from rebellion to depression stemmed from disobedience to God's chain of command. At the top was God, then fathers, then mothers, and finally children. His ministry spread through homeschooling networks, Christian schools, and even political circles. Many conservative leaders praised him for restoring traditional values. He never raised his voice, never seemed angry. His quiet authority made people trust him completely. But what many didn't realize was that Gothard's empire operated under absolute control. Inside the IBLP headquarters and its affiliated training centers, young men and women were sent to live and work, often in total obedience to the ministry's strict rules. Dating was forbidden. Music, movies, and even friendships were tightly monitored. Followers were taught that questioning authority meant defying God. On the surface, it looked like purity. In reality, it was fear disguised as faith. Rumors began surfacing in the 1,982nd stories from former staffers about inappropriate behavior and emotional manipulation. Still, Gothard's image was untouchable. His soft-spoken demeanor and spotless public record made accusations easy to dismiss. But by the 2000s, cracks were beginning to show. As more people left the movement, online communities started forming survivors, comparing notes, realizing their experiences were eerily similar. In 2014, everything changed. A group of former IBLP participants published detailed testimonies accusing Bill Gothard of years of misconduct toward young women under his mentorship. They described a pattern of grooming and psychological control within his organization. The allegations shocked the evangelical community. Gothard denied everything, insisting his interactions had been misunderstood. But the board of IBLP forced him to resign soon after the accusations became public. The scandal didn't stop there. In 2016, a group of women filed a lawsuit against Gothard and the IBLP, alleging decades of emotional and physical abuse. The case drew national attention, especially as former students of his programs began speaking out publicly. Though the lawsuit was eventually dismissed due to statutes of limitation, the stories themselves painted a damning picture, one of a man who built an empire on purity while failing to live by his own teachings. By then, Gothard had become a recluse. He withdrew from public life, living quietly in Illinois, occasionally posting statements online, declaring his innocence. Meanwhile, documentaries and exposés began peeling back the image of the wholesome families his teachings had shaped. The most famous example came from the Duggar family stars of the reality show 19 Kids and Counting, who had long followed Gothard's methods. As scandals within that family came to light, so did renewed attention on Gothard's ideology and how deeply it had affected generations. The preacher who once filled arenas now spends his days defending himself online, his ministry largely dismantled. His sprawling headquarters, once teeming with activity, stands nearly empty. To those who grew up under his system, he's a reminder of how religion can be used to justify control, not compassion. Bill Gothard's story is less about sudden collapse and more about slow erosion, a lifetime of authority finally undone by the truth. For decades, he told people to avoid the world's corruption, all while harboring it within his own walls. His fall didn't come with handcuffs or headlines, but with testimony, the power of voices refusing to stay silent any longer. And while his influence has faded, his teachings still echo in parts of American culture, a warning that even ideas wrapped in scripture can hide the flaws of the man preaching them. But Gothard's quiet downfall would pale next to the man who came next, a self-proclaimed reincarnation of Jesus Christ who led his followers deep into the frozen wilderness of Siberia. There, devotion turned into isolation, and faith became fear. Number 10. Sergey Torop, Vissarion. In the depths of the Siberian wilderness, thousands of people abandoned their homes, their families, and their identities to follow a man who claimed he was Jesus Christ reborn. They built wooden villages, gave up modern technology, and devoted their lives to his teachings. For nearly 3 decades, Sergey Torop, known to his followers as Vissarion, ruled over a secretive spiritual commune in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But when the snow finally settled on his so-called paradise, what authorities uncovered was far from divine. Sergey Torop was born in 1961 inches, Krasnodar, Russia, and spent most of his early life working ordinary jobs. He served in the Soviet military, married young, and later worked as a traffic police officer in a small Siberian town. But in 1989, as the Soviet Union began to collapse and faith in old systems crumbled, Torop claimed to have experienced a revelation. He announced that God had spoken to him, that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, sent to Earth to save humanity from spiritual decay. His message came at the perfect time. The Soviet collapse had left millions searching for meaning, and Vissarion's calm voice and prophetic certainty filled that void. In 1991, he founded the Church of the Last Testament, a community that promised peace, purity, and rebirth. He told his followers that the end of the world was near and that only those who followed his teachings would survive the coming apocalypse. Over the next few years, hundreds of followers traveled deep into the Siberian taiga to join him. There, in a remote forest region about 3,000 miles east of Moscow, they built wooden homes and gardens, living without cars, phones, or electricity. The settlement became known as the City of Sunday. They celebrated Vissarion's birthday as a holy day and used his calendar instead of the Gregorian one, marking time from the year of his appearance. To outsiders, it looked like a harmless religious commune. But for those inside, life was anything but free. Followers were required to hand over their money, property, and independence. Marriages were arranged, diets were strictly controlled, and dissent was forbidden. Vissarion demanded complete devotion, presenting himself as the only path to salvation. He banned meat, alcohol, and tobacco, claiming they polluted the soul. Those who questioned his authority were publicly shamed or expelled into the frozen wilderness with nothing but a few supplies. As the years passed, rumors of abuse and coercion began to surface. Former members described the community as a cult that isolated families and exploited their labor. Children were raised to worship Vissarion as a literal god, and adults were expected to treat his every word as law. Still, Russian authorities hesitated to intervene. The group was remote, peaceful on the surface, and deeply self-contained. That changed in 2020. After nearly 30 years of silence, the Russian government launched a major operation against the Church of the Last Testament. In a dramatic scene that seemed torn from a movie, helicopters hovered over the forests of Krasnoyarsk as armed officers descended on the commune. Vissarion and his 2 top aides were arrested and flown to Moscow for questioning. State media broadcast the footage nationwide. The once revered Christ of Siberia, gray-haired and calm, surrounded by commandos in camouflage. Authorities charged him with forming an illegal religious organization, extracting money from followers, and inflicting psychological harm. Investigators accused him of running a cult that preyed on vulnerable people, isolating them from society while enriching himself. His followers were devastated. Some wept outside courtrooms, praying for his release. Others quietly began to question everything they had believed for decades. In 2023, after a lengthy trial, Vissarion was sentenced to 12 years in a Russian penal colony. He continues to deny any wrongdoing, claiming his arrest was political persecution. Meanwhile, the once bustling settlements of his followers have largely emptied. Many of those who left struggle to rebuild their lives, learning how to live in a world they were taught to reject. The story of Sergey Torop, the man who called himself Vissarion, is a modern-day parable of how easily faith can be twisted into control. His followers weren't foolish. They were searching for meaning in a world that had lost its structure. And in that search, they found a man who promised eternal peace, but delivered isolation and obedience. Today, the frozen forests of Siberia stand quiet. The wooden homes remain, slowly sinking into the snow. And the self-proclaimed Christ of Siberia sits behind prison walls, no longer leading prayers beneath the northern lights, but serving time for the empire he built on devotion and deception. From American prophets to Indian godmen, from polished televangelists to self-declared messiahs, each of these stories carries the same warning that when faith becomes power and power goes unchecked, even the holiest words can lead to the darkest outcomes.